So welcome back, OT friends, and welcome to the Uncommon OT series. My name is Patricia Modis. I'm the Transitions OT, and I'm your host. So today, I'm super excited to introduce you to our special guest. We have with us Kirsten Beshay. Kirsten is an OT with 5 years of experience as a contractor for the Global Google Ergonomics Team. Yes, you heard me correctly. I said the Global Google Ergonomics Team. She loves introducing OT practitioners to the best-kept secret of the therapy world. Kirsten completed her OTD at Boston University, where she designed her flagship course, Ergonomics for OT Practitioners. She has also worked in healthcare and school settings as an occupational therapist, where ergonomic principles were ever present. So Kirsten enjoys speaking at conferences and on podcasts to introduce ergonomics to more practitioners. So without further ado, I'd like to present to you Dr. Kirsten Beshay. Welcome.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm so happy to be here. You make such a great podcast that teaches us about so many interesting things within the OT world.
Oh, thank you for that. That's what brings you to our show today, right? I'm sure so many OTs are very much interested in learning about your subspecialty, specifically ergonomics, and particularly being able to work as an OT for a company like Google, right? This is something that us OTs only dream about, or we think it's actually fictional, and here you are. So looking forward to hear a little bit more about that. And, particularly how we can encourage other OTs to branch out into ergonomics. So before we dive into all of that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you and your background, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a 6th year OT, thereabouts. I've been working for a little while, and I just love, variety within the profession. So as you mentioned, I've worked in acute care. I currently work part-time in school OT, and I do a lot with ergonomics. And so I just, have always had a really hard time choosing what practice area I was interested in. In school, I was just really baffled because everything sounded so interesting. And I think that's one thing that I really love is I still get to do different things. Whether I'm like doing 2 things part-time or, I decide to move in a different direction and get some new skills like I did with ergonomics. That's one thing that I really find keeps me like excited about working, is just having that variety. So that's a little bit about just what I like about OT. I also love making sourdough bread, which is a quarantine habit that I picked up right at the beginning of the pandemic.
Oh, what a great skill to develop during the pandemic.
I'm slowing down a little bit, but I've got to, you have the starter, you have to keep feeding. So I got to keep going.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about that. I share your love for the fact that our profession can be so versatile, and how we really have this, ability to be able to work in a variety of settings, right? And, totally different types of settings, but really still applying the same skill set. So thanks for sharing a little bit about yourself. Can you tell us a little bit more now about the uncommon OT work that you do and, currently perhaps the population that you're serving and some of the services that you're offering?
Yeah. So I'll start with my 5 years as a contractor at Google, and then I'll let you know a little bit about what I do today. While I was there, I got to support a lot of different types of settings within the company. In ergonomics, you usually have 4 types of settings. Office ergonomics are very common, and that's probably what most people think of, but you can also have lab ergonomics. You can have industrial ergonomics, which can have, anything from like an oil rig to an industrial kitchen to a factory. And then you can have healthcare ergonomics, which is another area where we as OTs, might have tie-ins. So I got to do a variety of things within the company there. I also got to develop some different pilot projects for spreading awareness or doing different things to just kind of advance the department. And I got to use a variety of assessment tools which was pretty fun. I also was fortunate to get to travel the world a bit, which was pretty amazing and something that unfortunately we as OTs don't always get the chance to do for work. So I loved that part. And I was specifically working with adults in the workplace, both preventatively and after discomfort or injury had set in. I would generally review equipment and work practice recommendations, as well as make environmental change recommendations. But I would also spend time addressing the different psychosocial aspects of work that might be hampering them.
Oh.
So that's a quick overview of kind of my contractor days there.
Okay.
These days, I have my own ergonomic consulting business. So in some ways, it looks very similar in terms of supporting those 4 types of practice settings. I do continue to do ergonomic evaluations, often one-on-one or in kind of a group or team training setting. And I'm also applying for research grants in ergonomics and developing an online course for therapy practitioners about ergonomics, because as you said, I just think it's such a fabulous area and a lot of people don't really know what it is or how to get into it. So those are the things that keep me busy.
Yes. Well, wow. So this is a lot. I'm kind of trying to figure out where to dive in. Let's back up a little bit and start with the Google stuff, because I think people are super interested in that too. You talked about these 4 different areas of ergonomics. So, is this generally ergonomics in general, or is this ergonomics at Google?
It's in general, I would say.
Oh, it's in general. Okay.
Yeah. Those are pretty broad categories. Office ergonomics tend to be if someone's using a computer workstation, whether that's a home office, because now, of course, we all have kind of, not necessarily all of us, but a lot of us had to pivot to that. A lot of workers are still doing that to some extent more than they used to. And then also labs might involve either like a wet lab, like someone, pipetting chemicals.
Okay. So an actual laboratory and making sure that that's properly situated. Okay.
Or it could be a dry lab, which might be more like electronics. So you might be looking at people like electrical engineers who are building, something, and you're looking at the tools they're using and the movements they're using to do that.
Okay. I'm also thinking like maybe, I don't know, podcasting here, the audio editing, machinery or the equipment, right? Okay.
Sure. There are just so many different types of work. And so there are so many different settings within those categories. You could probably fit that in a couple.
You mentioned, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's especially broad because, that can look like, a kitchen in a restaurant, or it can look like, I mentioned an oil rig. I heard an ergonomist speak who does just oil rigs, and that was really intense sounding. You go offshore and you do the evaluations and you make recommendations on the oil rig.
Okay.
And then, of course, factories are a very common place that you would support as well because, there is a risk for injury. There's so much repetition. The pace is so high. There are a lot of risk factors there.
Yes. And then the last one that you mentioned was healthcare ergonomics. Yes. And you said that OTs have a little bit of an in there.
And yeah, I think it's just especially near and dear to my heart because I started out in acute care and I loved it, but I had an old back injury before OT school. And so I loved it, but I started feeling like, should I be doing this that long? I started getting nervous. I had a friend who got a back injury in a similar setting her first year. So you just become a little more aware. Whereas I think in school, you're taught transfer techniques and you're told, if you work out, if you do these correctly, you'll be okay.
Yes.
You need to be careful. And then I think you get out there and you realize, well, even in a perfect situation, sometimes, I had a professor who was working in long-term care, was assisting a patient with a shower, and the patient had a seizure. And so she caught the patient and injured her back for life. And so she was doing everything right, So all that to say, I think that we as OTs can have a really special place in healthcare ergonomics because a lot of us come from, working as a healthcare professional, but also we can, if we understand some of the ergonomic side as well about weight limits and, making sure equipment is running properly, even some basic things. I think we understand the psychology behind why people might prefer not to use, a mechanical lift. but also we can come at it from both sides. So that's an especially interesting area to me too.
Yeah. And also our systems knowledge, right? I think that works really well with all of that.
Oh, yes.
So, okay, great. So now that we've got that, we've got that basic knowledge of ergonomics. You mentioned assessment tools. What types of assessment tools did you use? Just, for us OTs to really be able to connect.
Yeah, there are a couple good ones that I used all the time. A lot of organizations will develop their own more informal assessment or often a checklist because ergonomic checklists are so common. You could Google computer ergonomic checklist and just find, 5 that would work really well. So that's a great place to start. So apart from that, there is something called the computer workstation checklist or the CWC. That's a really great one.
Okay.
And that's, a checklist system. That's also specific to office ergonomics. But a lot of the assessments, including the rapid upper limb assessment, the RULA, and similar assessments to that look at one part of the body, such as, the upper limb, the upper half of the body, especially within any task. So whether you're working in a factory or you're working at, at your desk, we can use that assessment to take some measurements of like how many degrees your head is tilted or how many degrees your shoulder is flexed and things like that. And then calculate a standardized score to say, oh, you really need to make some changes. So sometimes during an assessment, I would do something like that. There are a lot of good assessments out there. And the good news is in ergonomics, a lot of them are free because they're either made by a government organization or they've been around for a really long time. So I would recommend Googling the REBA and the RULA, but there are a lot of really good ones. I could talk about that for a long time, but if anyone wants to reach out to me and know more about assessments, I can give you a handful.
Yes, we will definitely have your information listed as well as some of these assessments that you've already talked about. So fascinating. I'm super fascinated. All right. So assessments, they're free. You mentioned earlier about, OTs having a particular within the healthcare ergonomics field, particularly. How often is it that these positions are filled by OTs?
Yeah, that's such a great question because I think that is what stumps a lot of people. And they're generally not filled by OTs, at least in my experience, and they are not listed as OT positions. And so I think this is one of the big reasons that people do kind of get rule themselves out or don't know quite what to do.
Yes.
So I was employed as an ergonomic specialist, and I was an OT, and they really valued my background and my knowledge. And, that people I think that I worked with also found that, is kind of a credibility help to them during assessments, but I was not employed as an OT in that job. So I was the only OT in my department. I do know of a lot of OTs and CODAs and PTs and PTAs who are working in ergonomics in similar types of situations where the job title might say either ergonomist or ergonomic specialist or ergonomic consultant, but they are using all of that knowledge. So I think that that can be a limiting factor, but I think that it doesn't need to be.
I somehow had it in my head that ergonomists. Ergonomists. Okay. Yeah. Didn't come out right. We're OTs, and then it wasn't until you mentioned that, we have a particular, we can get in here that, I think it's super important that OTs listen to this particular episode, especially if they have an interest. Ergonomics is always something that I've heard about throughout my career while I was in school, but I was always interested in it, but just didn't really take that next step. I wonder if it has to do with the fact that, there weren't really too many trainings like what you offer at the time.
And also a lot of the jobs that when I am looking for jobs, I go to Indeed.com or I healthcare websites or education websites, but I go to these job sites and I search occupational therapist. and then I see what comes up. And honestly, a lot of the job descriptions look exactly the same because they're copy pasting like, what we're able to do with our license. And so I'm like, I don't even know what this job really specifically wants, but I do know they want an OT. And so I think we're so used to that when there's a job that's not specifying that, and they might not even know that OTs make great ergonomists or ergonomic specialists because they haven't had one apply before. And we can talk about how I would approach that because we can obviously convince them that we're excellent at it because we are. But I think it kind of goes both ways. Sometimes you just have to kind of know what gap to jump across.
Yes. And how to present yourself, right? Or how to sell yourself. I think that's one piece that may not be emphasized enough in a lot of our curriculums is really how do we self-promote, right? And because especially in non-traditional settings or settings where OTs are not common, you have to promote. There's no choice. It's part of the job, and it's to inform. So do you feel that you got to do your share of that over there at Google?
Yeah, somewhat. I think it's easier now that I have my own practice because, as you said, you have to.
Yes.
So that's something I think generally as OTs we're pretty uncomfortable with, myself included. And so I'm still learning about that, but it's gotten a lot easier over the years. And I think it was just about presence when I was when I was a contractor at Google. Was like, I'm an OT. I want to go to this OT conference. I had a level 2 OT student for a summer within that department. So to me, I was really hoping to get exposure for the profession just by, being visible about those things.
Yes, fantastic. That was one of my questions. Did you take students? I'm sure there was some kind of line or some kind of contest vying for that work placement. So, all right, let me regroup. So you talked about, really using a lot of your psychosocial knowledge, looking at various equipment in the workplace. Can you describe to us a little bit, like what a typical day might be like, or what a typical session might be like for you while you were a contractor?
Sure. So I can't share too specifically about, that job and what a typical day looked like, but I can tell you now and in general what a typical day would look like. I think they're all relatively similar.
Okay.
So on a typical day doing ergonomics, I would likely have a few hours set aside for email collaborations with other professionals. Sometimes that's human resources, especially if someone has a work-related injury, or an accommodation request if they have some medical issue and HR wants to buy equipment and they don't really know quite what to buy. Or that could even be facilities staff. So contacting a facilities person to say, hey, can you help us lower this lab bench that has special equipment needed to do that type of thing.
Yeah.
Or ideally also being involved in helping a company pick out furniture so that you're not going in retroactively to adjust it. I would also spend most of my day doing individual ergonomic assessments. That's kind of our bread and butter. These generally take between 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the complexity and the model that you're working with. I know some places prefer to have really quick assessments because that's just the kind of what people feel like they have time for. And then some people really want that full hour so that they can share their concerns and really have a dedicated time set aside for that.
Okay.
Those evaluations can be done at a client's desk. They can be done over video conferencing, which of course is, again, more and more common these days. Or they can be done in a clinic that has a simulated work environment, such as, a computer workstation setup. Okay. I generally prefer to assess the client's physical workspace when possible because they're more likely to keep the adjustments that you make, for one thing.
Yes.
And you just get a really accurate look. But I do find that once you get comfortable with those video assessments of ergonomics, you don't miss a lot of those things. You might have to have people move the camera around a little bit, but you can kind of cover the same things, especially if people are at home. It just allows you to see exactly what's happening. So
yeah, and probably, really kind of problem solve, right? Because not everyone has ergonomic chairs and, proper furniture, right? You should see my setup right now.
Well, especially at home, and especially given that many people were within 1 week suddenly working from home for, sometimes over a year.
Yes.
And none of us thought it was going to be that long. And so I know for myself, I just kind of grabbed a dining chair, sat at my dining table, stuck a box under my feet, and then I was there for 6 months. And eventually I almost broke my dining chair because it was the cheapest, IKEA chair. And I did add some cushions and things to make it a little bit more ergonomic, but one of the legs was coming off because it's not designed to be used 8 hours a day for 6 months.
Yeah.
So I actually loved doing assessments during that time. And I still love doing home assessments because you do get to use that creativity. Whereas in the office, sometimes there's a list of equipment and you'd really try to stick to that.
Mm-hmm.
At home, sometimes people don't have any equipment that they can order, or, they really want to avoid, purchasing that. And so you can say, do you have an Amazon box? Can you stick that under your feet? Do you have a couple old OT textbooks if it's an OT?
Yes.
Can you stick those under your monitor? That's exactly what I have under my laptop right now, by the way. And so I think that really was a sweet spot because as OTs, we are so creative. We use that a lot. And so the home assessments were really like my return to that,
yes.
Where I felt like I was building things out of what people had in their home.
Yeah. And I bet you've gotten pretty good where you can probably just look at, like, for me, for example, you're looking at my screen. Are you able to identify some things already that are kind of like malpositioned?
No. People always think that. And I mean, I'm sure I don't have perfect posture sitting here right now either. I would probably have you put the screen to the side of your desk perpendicular to you. And then I could kind of see the desk height and see the monitor height. But I mean, we do the best that we can at home.
Yes. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think I wanted to just kind of get an idea of what do you do during a typical day? Do you ever do groups, or have you ever done groups?
Definitely. And that really depends on, how popular those are. So in some places I might primarily do, team trainings or groups. And then in some settings, I might really almost exclusively do individual assessments. But I love doing the team trainings because they are more preventative and you can really, get buy-in. And a lot of the times people will say, oh, well, I didn't know my chair had that feature. I just they're not super intuitive. A lot of these office or desk chairs. And also a lot of people just, haven't really said, okay, I'm going to take 20 minutes and I'm going to read this chair manual and I'm going to guess what I think it needs to be adjusted to. So, sometimes just having 30 minutes together with a team, you feel like you're having such an impact in the same way that I think we do with other, prevention, types of OT.
Yes. Well, I love the diversity and the work that you were doing even there, right? You were doing a lot of training. You're also doing a lot of one-on-one work. You're able to do assessments and guessing. Can you give us an example of a typical goal that you might have with the client?
Sure. So typically I would do a one-off evaluation. So I wouldn't necessarily have goals to return to within the future therapy sessions, apart from, of course, the implementation of the adjustments.
Yes.
Which is, it's a challenge because we're human. So it's not like you set everything up and then it's always going to be like that. Mm-hmm. But I would also say that psychosocial factor, like the behavior modification, is a big piece. If we adjust the equipment, if I go in and I move everything around and then I leave, I'm probably not really having that much of an impact because oftentimes I walk by a week later and the desk is back up to the height that it was, or, like the person is still sitting all day, and I'm guilty of this too. But just having a little bit of that like motivational interview time where you're like, okay, ideally every hour you would be getting up for a couple of minutes. Whether, you might not have a standing desk, but just grabbing some water or taking a stretch break and sitting back down. So, what do you think, if they're motivated to do that, what do you think would be the tools that would help you stick to that? And people will have all sorts of great ideas with setting a timer or getting an app, or I've had people who tend to push their keyboard back up the desk when I move it close to the edge. They'll stick hot pink Post-its under it. So when it moves, they have the visual. So, that's a great piece that I think, you need to, same way that we do with any patient education in any setting, you really need to have the buy-in and get the problem solving with the client.
Yes. And, really build that rapport with them initially to even get to that.
Yes.
Right. So
even if it's a one-time meeting, and sometimes I do work with people a few times if, there's something more serious going on, but, even within that one session, if someone's in pain and you're kind and you're there to help, often that's still been a really meaningful connection for me, even if I don't see them again. So I still kind of get that meaningful interaction with the client.
I'm glad that you're able to squeeze that in, because I imagine having these one-off sessions can be pretty challenging. You have a lot to accomplish during that time. I'm so used to having a follow-up session with a client and, at least having some time to mull over the assessment and then to really, be able to give them a nice plan at the next session. So you've got to do everything all in one. So that's an extra challenge. But, I'm also imagining your place. So I'm talking about goals. So goals typically, aside from obviously a client achieving those goals and mastering those skills, typically they're connected to payment, right? Or reimbursement.
Right.
So in your case, no one was billing insurance for these sessions. Yes.
And that's such a wonderful thing about ergonomics is that's one of the few areas that we aren't having to worry about insurance. And of course, there are pros and cons to that. But when you are doing it in a work setting and generally the company is paying for you to be there, you do have a little bit more flexibility. And that's why people make their own checklists, for a company sometimes, because things tend to be a little bit more simplistic. Like, we don't need to collect every tiny detail. Like, tell us what's relevant and tell us what you recommend. And in some ways that's really freeing because we just have so much paperwork as a profession.
Yes. It takes away from the joy. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing with us a little bit about that. So you've moved on and you've branched out. So I want to hear about that next. What propelled that step? How are you doing? How are you feeling about branching out and kind of doing your own thing? I know you've got Thrive Ergonomics, which I want you to, tell us a little bit more about.
Yes. Let's see, where to start. So I guess, to start from the beginning, what really led me to make the jump into ergonomics, which then led me to this, this new jump, was that, I just loved, all the different patients that I was working with. I loved the hospital, but I started to get really worried about doing patient transfers with an old back injury that I'd mentioned. And so I decided to explore ergonomics to really give my body a break. And that's really why I love recommending this to people, because it's relatively low stress and it's relatively reasonable in terms of workload and physical demands. And so after doing that for 5 years as a contractor at Google, I started thinking again about, okay, I really love this type of work. I really love the education. And I love that, I feel like I'm also taking care of myself at the same time while I get some of these other benefits, like the client impact and, feeling like you're seeing the change quickly. Yes. So I kind of started thinking about what the next step was to grow my skills. And so that came to a head when I met my advisor at Boston University, Karen Jacobs, one of the past AOTA presidents, who is just amazing. And she's done so much work in ergonomics. So she's a wonderful person to look up. But she encouraged me to do the occupational therapy doctorate program at BU. They have one specifically for post-professional OTs. So if you've already got your OT degree and you've been working, I did it part-time while I was working. And I decided to develop a course for OT practitioners who were, not totally sure how to get into ergonomics and were interested in learning more about it, because over the years, I had just met so many OT students and seasoned OTs who were just a little baffled about how to make that connection. And I know some of us got, I'd say we all got varying levels of training on ergonomics in school, but it's really one of like so many things that we touch on that it's not always a lot of time specifically on ergonomics, and especially those practical things that you mentioned, like getting a job or what to look for in terms of positions or how to promote yourself in interviews. So I just felt like so many people were like so interested in what I did, and were like so surprised that, you know, OTs could do something like that in ergonomics. And I just really I ended up recruiting like 4 people that were friends of friends who were OT practitioners into the field of ergonomics, because I just was like, this is so wonderful. And then they're all, you know, doing ergonomic consulting now.
Yeah. Great.
And so I just felt like if I'm going to do a project for my doctorate, I think this is something that I would love to see more of us doing. And so I was hoping to bridge that gap and have more of a formal process and information available for people. So these days I do my own ergonomic consulting, but I'm also spending a lot of time developing my course, which is ergonomics for OT practitioners. It's about 4 hours, and I run through the standardized assessments we talked about.
Yes.
I run through kind of that basic knowledge about different settings. And we also talk about jobs. So like what to look for, how to market yourself, what type of resume to have, those types of things.
Fabulous.
I would just love so many of us to be working in that and have that be more of a common practice area instead of an uncommon one.
Yes. Well, you're doing your part in that. That's for sure. You know, developing this course, encouraging your friends to jump into the field. I love it. I'm pumped. So tell us a little bit more about the course. Is it something that, you know, how do we register for it? How is it, is there a fee? What do you get? Do you get credits?
Yes. So, as I mentioned, it's about 4 hours long. I'll share my website with you so that people are able to look it up if they're interested.
Yes.
And I've really designed it to be evidence-based, but extremely practical. So there are a lot of case studies. There are a lot of, when you're looking at standardized assessments, you're actually going to be analyzing a job. I have like a video recording of someone doing a task, and then you will use the standardized assessment to analyze that. And then I have my copy. And so we can kind of dialogue about that.
Oh, cool.
And then I also have a recording of myself doing a virtual ergonomic evaluation. So just like really, really hands-on things that I want people to feel like they can actually start, actually start working in that, to go from kind of that, like, I think I know about ergonomics, but I'm not totally sure how to get there to that point. It's about 4 hours long, and I currently have early bird pricing available depending on when people are listening to this. So the normal price is $200 for the 4 hours, but I do have early bird pricing at the moment. So if you look it up and it's still there, lucky for you.
Okay. What's the early bird price?
The early bird price is $150.
Okay, that's a great discount.
Yeah.
For being the early bird. Okay. Great. So we'll list all of that. And this is available at any time, right? People can, it's a self-paced course.
It has not officially launched yet. We are in the final stages of pre-registration. So hence the early bird discount. Okay. Once it does officially roll out, that will be when that early bird time ends.
Okay.
So look for it in the next couple of months, depending on when you're listening.
All right. Got it. So are you finding that you're busier due to the pandemic, or because we're just more in this virtual space interacting with each other? Do you find that you're busier nowadays?
I would say I always had a component of like virtual ergonomic services that I was doing. And so in some ways that didn't change, but certainly the ability to like end one meeting and then immediately join another with someone completely in a different place. It does fill up your schedule a little bit more. There are pros and cons, but sometimes it's kind of nice to be driving around or walking between people. So, I think that that's something that's really interesting. This is something I'm hoping to study in terms of office ergonomics, is the impact of remote working at home on, our physical and mental health. Because I do think that from talking to people and from reading the research literature of the preliminary things we found from the pandemic, sometimes it does increase your stress. Sometimes it's harder to disconnect at the end of the day. Sometimes You also have like family, around in the middle of the day. And so these lines get really blurred and that can be really stressful. So, all that said, in terms of ergonomics specifically, I do think there has been an increase in interest because at some point people realized, I'm going to be at home for a while and I have no equipment. I'm on my laptop and I'm starting to really feel uncomfortable.
Yes.
So I definitely am noticing a trend, even as people, a lot of people have started going back. Some people might still be at home some days a week. It's really different than it was before, at least for a lot of my clients. And so I think that we're just going to have to keep being flexible about what services we offer and just follow the trend there.
Yes. And, be the true OTs that we are, right? And kind of modify as needed. But yeah, you bring up a good point about the fact that we're sort of slowly coming out of the pandemic. So now work situations are varying again for people, right? So where they may have been working from home 5 days a week, now it's only a couple of days. And now there's this other space that we need to consider. So so enlightening, this conversation we're having.
Well, and I also realized that I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I'm around a lot of tech, and a lot of tech workers have had a ton of flexibility with working from home, or maybe it's not an option, but
yes.
And the Bay Area is very cautious in terms of pandemic precautions. So I realized that for many people in other parts of the country, this might look totally different. People might have all been back at work for a long time, but that's one of the other interesting things is it just varies so much.
Yes. And you work with folks all over the country, all over the world. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind. So how do you continue to stay on top of your current knowledge? I know you talked a little bit about research and being on top of that. Anything else that you do to stay on top of ergonomic knowledge?
Yeah, I think it's so important to stay on top of that research literature as an OT practitioner. And I really think that this is one of the things that sets us apart within the field of ergonomics because we are trained on evidence-based practice. And we haven't actually touched on this, but there is no specific license or degree that you need to do ergonomics. And so that really brings a lot of variety into the field in terms of who is working there.
Got it.
But that also really sets us apart because we do have that training in evidence-based practice. We do have, we're very used to using standardized assessments. We do a lot of client education. Of course, our bread and butter activity analysis is something we do all the time in ergonomics. And so
anatomy and physiology knowledge.
And just understanding of like medical diagnoses. If you're working with someone that has a specific one. Yeah, it all comes into play. And a lot of people might not be coming in with, nearly as extensive of a background in those things. So, especially with understanding the research literature, I think that a lot of people might not have had training in that or had access to that. And so, if we really make the effort to keep current, I don't know that always happens in the field of ergonomics as quickly as I would like it to. And I think that's an area where we can really push forward.
Yes. And even, specifically OTs and ergonomics, right? I'm not sure how much literature there is out there for that. And I think, again, Dr. Beshay, you're paving the way.
Thank you. Yeah, you do sometimes have to look outside of OT journals. There are human factors and ergonomics journals that cover different topics, that sometimes those are more specific to engineering and like building equipment. And so we really have to be willing to look there. We do have some articles on ergonomics within the OT world, not a lot, but there are some interesting ones. And then I do think it's an area where we're expanding. So I would just keep an eye in a few different places to keep current.
Okay. Maybe you can let me know some of those articles, some of your favorite articles, and I can include that in our resources too. So our listeners can have that. Now, can we switch gears and talk a little bit about money?
Yes.
It's always like this very interesting, again, piece of tidbit that folks want to talk about. Can you tell us a little bit about salary, compensation, what you may charge at this point, right, for your services in your private practice? Anything of that?
Sure. So I would say that my pay has been pretty comparable during my work in acute care, school-based OT, and ergonomics. And again, I realize this might really depend on the part of even the part of the country, if you're in the US, that you're in.
Yes.
So for myself, they've been pretty comparable. I haven't seen any huge increases or decreases when I move around between those settings.
Okay.
I have been able to make the case for my hourly rate based on the other settings where I've worked.
Mm-hmm.
So again, as OT practitioners, I really think we have more leverage in this area than people coming in, with other backgrounds might, just because we can, when they ask you your previous salary,
yes,
our previous salary might have been a bit higher because we were working somewhere that required us to have an OT license. So, at least in my experience, that has been helpful. But it really is going to depend on what the client will pay. And that is so influenced by A, the economy, and B, the area where you work.
Yes.
So because I live near large tech companies, I've likely had a bit of an easier time negotiating.
Yeah.
If you're seeing clients through a company, they would pay you using a cash-based model for the hours that you support them, whether it's a one-off or a regular occurrence. And then when I work with private clients, it's also cash-based. As I said earlier, there are definitely some pros and cons to that, but it does mean that I'm less dependent on insurance than I would be in a different setting.
Yes.
So if people are kind of trying to figure out what price point to set, of course, look at your competition to some extent in the area, and that would probably be the most accurate way. And also, just getting a sense, doing some market research and seeing what clients would be willing to pay. I will also add that my advisor, Karen Jacobs, my former advisor, one of her mottos that I think is very helpful is build your reputation by offering some services for free in the beginning.
Okay.
And of course, we talk about self-promotion. As OTs, we might be tempted to do too much of this. You want to know what you're worth, but at least in the beginning, establishing some local connections by doing a little bit of pro bono work may actually allow you to ask some questions about pricing and what they'd be willing to pay and just get your foot in the door a little bit. So that might be something to consider, even though it's a little bit of a longer game.
Yeah, I love that piece of advice because it's sort of, again, the business end of things, right? And how do you get yourself out there? How do you inform people of your service even? And at the same time, being able to get a little bit of feedback on the service that you're offering, right? Because then that becomes part of the game. So,
because I know that. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I just remember when I was first looking into ergonomic consulting, I talked to another OT who was starting her own business. And she said, it's really hard to gauge the pricing because if someone doesn't pick you as a client, you don't know why, you don't know if it was your pricing, and no one really wants to tell you they offered me this much or something. It's just not something you're going to hear. So I think that's where having those like relationships and starting with pro bono work, you might be a little bit more likely to hear those types of things than if you're kind of cold calling someone.
Yes. Well, can you tell us what a typical ergonomic assessment rate or cost would be? I know that varies depending on your geographical region and
I think it's a bit tough to give you a specific number just because even client to client, it varies right now depending on if the company is paying or if the individual and whether it's virtual or not.
Okay.
So there isn't like one set number. It tends to be more case by case.
Okay, got it. And you said that these services are generally cash based. Are any of these ever covered by insurance?
This isn't really a path that I've gone down. I do think that it's possible, I think that if you're thinking about the categories that we usually bill insurance for, some of those are things that we're doing when we're doing ergonomics. But in my experience, that's pretty rare that people have gone that route. It's generally because it's often a workplace setting. It's generally coming from the company. So I would find that pretty rare, but not impossible.
Okay. So like in your private practice, for example, do you ever work with individuals who may be under workers' compensation because of a disability from work, for example, and then, with your services be covered by that?
That's a great question. It's a little bit complicated because if you're in a workers' compensation case, oftentimes there's a very specific provider that you need to go to, either because that's what the workers' compensation company has decided. They tend to have one. And so even the company might not have the company that you work for when you file the claim might not have much of a say in that.
Yes.
So I generally haven't formally had workers' compensation clients. I might be at a company and work with someone who says they had an injury and maybe they filed workers' compensation, but it's generally separate.
Okay.
But that's definitely an area within ergonomics and work hardening and return to work. That larger area, we definitely can and do work in that. That's just not generally the direction I've gone in. But
yes,
I do know of other OTs that have their own businesses just doing some of those things and are very successful. So I think that is another great avenue to think about too.
Yeah, and I love that that's coming up now because it's actually another subspecialty.
Yeah. So many.
How versatile we are. I love it. But this has been so helpful. Do you have any career advice? I know you've got your program, you've got your course that we can take. So aside from taking your course, do you have any career advice for any of our listeners on how to get started on this path? I know you shared with us a little bit what motivated you to get into this type of work and shared with us your path to this type of work. And I'm a big fan of Karen Jacobs and the BU program. Actually thought of that myself for a hot minute until I decided, no, not going back to school. But love that program. So do you have any advice for our listeners?
Yes. One detail I don't think I've shared about how I ended up in ergonomics is when I was still an OT student, we had a week externship where it was very informal. You were just supposed to kind of like go learn leadership skills or, see a different clinical setting than you've been in. But it was like you weren't really expected to do much. You just were basically shadowing somewhere, maybe a little unconventional. Okay. And so I ended up getting to shadow at the UCLA ergonomics department because one of my professors was actually the head of the department there at the time. And so after that, I realized, oh, wow, okay, there are OTs who do this. And so I just started going on LinkedIn and then looking up OTs or PTs or CODAs or PTAs who seem to be doing ergonomics and tech because, being in the Bay Area, that was like what was so cool to me. I was like, if I could ever do that, that would be so amazing. Right. And so I just started kind of cold messaging people and it was very uncomfortable for me. That's not my personality, but it's a little easier when it's not a face-to-face interaction. And then eventually a couple of people were very helpful. No one could really set me up with anything, in terms of observations, but I ended up with some manager's email address. And then she couldn't really help me at the time. A year later, I did an informational interview with her. They didn't have any openings. And then a year after that, I checked in and then this position had opened up that I spent 5 years doing. So that would be my big piece of advice is just go on LinkedIn, find people who are doing what you're interested in, especially if it's an uncommon thing and just message them. And, not everybody will respond. That's fine. You don't want to spam people, but doing that really was the reason that I got into this at the end of the day.
Fantastic.
We have such great OT Facebook groups. I spend a lot of time in those. So just start asking people who are doing what looks interesting to you. And usually people are really happy. OTs love sharing our profession in our practice area and being helpful. And so yes. I think that's a great way to get started.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that. My goodness, what a great story, right? Number one. And, credit to you. You're so passionate about what you wanted to do that, merged with your persistence, you ended up where you ended up, right? So I'm not surprised, because you went for it. And I love that you're sharing that story and piece of advice with our listeners, because I hope it encourages them to do just that. A lot of folks ask me, how do you get started in this? How do you get started in this? And honestly, there isn't a formula. You network, you talk, you put yourself out there, right? And once you do, that's really going to open some doors.
Yeah. And I heard a piece of advice when I was in college from one of my psychology professors who said he was very famous within the psychology world. I think he'd written the most popular intro to psychology textbook in the US. So he was like, the celebrity of the psychology department. And he said, I've had a great career. I'm super introverted. I hate networking, but you can get someone's business card at a conference and email them later. So that kind of gave me permission to be like, I don't have to go up to every person in person and talk to them. I can try, but it's okay to send an email or a message online, and that still counts as networking. And if that's more feasible for you, I think it's still a helpful option.
Absolutely. I mean, look at how we met, right? So I really feel that it's connections. It's making connections, whether it's virtually, whether it's over the phone, whether it's, now we're having a Zoom. It'll eventually or gradually also evolve, right? Beyond just that first message, just like our relationship. So, So happy that we've connected and that we're able to share with the OT world this amazing stuff that, you've been doing over the past 5 years. Is there any myths or misconceptions about, ergonomic work or work in ergonomics that you would like to demystify today?
Yeah, I think that we've already talked about it, but just that we can work in ergonomics is the big myth. And our job title might not be OT or CODA, might be ergonomic specialist or ergonomic consultant or ergonomist. A few different terms get used, but that doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't work. We're actually super well qualified. And fun side note, because you're not employed as like a licensed OT or a licensed CODA, CODAs actually have very similar access to like what they can offer in terms of services to OTs. So I think that's an especially cool factor of ergonomics that not many people know.
Ah, good to know. Can you share with us, and that may be one of the highs or successes already, but can you share with us some of your recent successes and, also some challenges and perhaps how you got through some of them?
Yeah. I would say landing that first job in ergonomics was so exciting because it really felt like this big leap. I wasn't really sure if I was qualified, and I wasn't sure what the competition was like. And of course, you never know that, but it was so exciting. And so that was definitely a big success. And then I would say the same for taking the leap for starting my own practice and starting the course was another huge leap. And it's just, I think it's exciting to be able to do what I feel really passionate about, what I think is important. I also mentioned hoping to do some research on how people are working from home because, man, this is just such a time. We don't totally understand how that's affecting people, and everybody has been doing it for a while. And so that's really exciting too. I'm hoping to be able to do more of that. And as I said, just getting to do assessments with people who are in pain, and you make a few adjustments and make them comfortable really quickly. It's just very meaningful. I would say my current challenge is learning all about marketing because as I launched the online course, as you said, we don't get a lot of training on some of these things in OT school. So I've definitely got some imposter syndrome there, but it's going okay. It's just a new thing for me to learn.
Yes. The imposter syndrome has come up a few times during these interviews, and I need to research this a little bit more, but I was just reading something about not using the words imposter syndrome because it's actually it's more damaging. It's really hurting ourselves more by saying that. But more on that later.
Right.
Congratulations to you on, branching out and starting your own thing. I wanted to spend a moment on that and, just kind of, share with us a little bit about how that happened, how you made that happen, how you're still making it happen.
Yeah, just in terms of like developing the course and
just starting your own kind of entrepreneurial business in ergonomics.
Yeah. So that is somewhat common within the field of ergonomics is people eventually starting, their own consulting business or private practice. I had never really thought of myself as an entrepreneur. So on the one hand, I didn't really have that in mind. But on the other hand, there are certain draws about having your own business and private practice and getting to make some decisions for yourself about your clients and how you want to approach things. So it just kind of gradually started sounding more exciting. And so then when I decided to do the OTD program I was feeling a little bit stagnant. I'd been doing ergonomic consulting at one place for a while, and I just felt like I needed to kind of expand on the skills that I had. And so that's why I did the OTD. And then when they were asking me to pick a project, well, what I'd really love is if more people were doing ergonomics. And so that eventually, kind of drew me into making the course. I wasn't sure where I was going to put it, or, at one point it was going to be a free webinar. And so it took me a while to get to the point where I decided, okay, I do want to have a business that this is affiliated with, that I do want to market it. And so it's definitely been a, grassroots learning experience for me. There are just so many OTs doing really interesting things and on social media, including you. And so just learning from other people about how they're marketing their offerings. And I have certainly taken some really wonderful online courses in the past for continuing education. And so those were also really helpful models to me, because I knew what I'd really liked from those and what had drawn me to take them. And so I'm just kind of trying to informally glean all of that. And then more recently establishing, now that I've got that about to launch, then establishing more of that regular ergonomic consulting again as well is just something that I always enjoy doing, because you don't want to lose that patient connection, I guess you would say. If you're just teaching people how to do something, it's really nice to still be able to do it yourself too.
Yeah. And again, it's great that you're able to do a little bit of both, right? You're filling your cup in the ways that you're choosing to.
Yeah.
So I congratulate you again on starting your own business. You started your own business on something that you're passionate about, right? You also designed I love how you kind of connected your OTD experience to something that you were already passionate about even before going into that. And, now here you are. So great planning and sequencing of your OT career path so far. I'm just super impressed. And I just, see nothing but wonderful things coming in the future. Hopefully by the time this episode airs, will sort of coincide with your launch of your course. And that'll also help with, a little bit of promotion, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's funny because I do feel like a lot of these steps that I've taken have just been leaps of faith, and you haven't really known the trajectory, and you're just like, well, I really think that this would be something that I want to do. I think this would be something that, it would push me and grow my career in that sense, but I don't know,
Yes.
how it will grow my career in actuality. And so I think for a lot of us, I'm assuming it just feels like you're just kind of blindly taking a step in something you want to do and hoping it works out. So it didn't feel to me like I had a real plan or a real path, but thank you for saying that. Hopefully when we take that, it does pan out like that.
And you follow your intuition is always there, right? So you're letting that guide you and you're listening to it, right? And then you're taking action and steps, right? Because your intuition could be speaking to you so loudly, but it's not until you take action that anything is really going to happen. So in this particular case, we connected. Here you are talking about your work. Hopefully we'll be able to share your work with, a few listeners who listen. So there you are. You're already putting yourself out there even further. So these are, I think, the little steps that are really important to highlight, because then us OTs or us OTPs have so many great ideas. I think that's part of being an OT, is to be really creative, but it's taking the action. Right. And again, coupled with self-promotion and, defeating that imposter syndrome. It's all a combination of all of those things. So again, I congratulate you on your steps, right, on your road to all of that. And I also thank you for, again, sharing your time, sharing your story with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and thank you for all that you do to grow our knowledge of different practice areas out there that are less common. I think that's so important. And so I also applaud the work that you're doing and taking that step and just growing our profession.
Thank you for mentioning that. It's, just like ergonomics is your passion, this is my passion too. So, it's just bringing about nothing but goodness so far. So if our listeners want to be in touch, I know you already mentioned that, but if they do, how do we find you? How do we follow you? How do we get in touch with you?
Yeah. So my website is thriveergonomics.com. That is where you can find more about me, about my course, ask questions. I do have free webinars coming up from time to time, so you can get up to date. And I also have a job handout on 10 tips for getting a job in ergonomics on the website. So that's my freebie. Feel free to grab it if you like it. I'm also on social media as Thrive Ergonomics. And so you're welcome to follow me there too. I try to have fun little ergo facts and build our knowledge a little bit as a profession on there.
Yes, I love them. I love your factoids. So we'll also list all of the freebies and all of your resources.
Great. Thank you so much.
On our notes. So thank you, Kirsten, for joining us. And I wish you all the best on your future endeavors.
Thank you, Patricia. You too. I mean, this is just such a wonderful platform, and I'll continue to listen for sure.
Thank you. Please don't forget to rate too.
Definitely.
And that wraps up another inspiring episode of the Uncommon OT series. Connect with me at www.transitionsot.com. And don't forget to sign up to be part of the Transitions OT community. By doing so, you'll receive my latest compiled list of uncommon OT practice settings, the latest news on mentoring offerings, uncommon OT live events, non-traditional OT resources, and more. You may also follow me on my social media pages on Instagram and LinkedIn. And if you love this episode, head on over to Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, and Google Podcasts to follow, rate, and leave a review. I also ask you to consider pledging your support to my Passion Podcast project by being a patron on Patreon. It is very much appreciated. Sending big OT love. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.